Should we salvage parts of the Titanic and bring it up to the surface? This is a question that's kind of been on my mind for years now. In fact, I'm not the only one. There are several debates happening right now as to whether these parts and pieces of the original ship should be brought up for people to see in museums and such. And there are some really complex issues at hand that we'll get to along the way in this video. One of the first issues is the morality of it. First of all, is it right to rummage through an area where people had died and bring up those pieces? Some people attribute that to the same thing as robbing a grave. And others, they don't see it that way. Other people see it as more like bringing things up to the surface so that way people can learn about them in an educated way. It's hard to take either side because on one hand, I'm sure that even the people who believe we shouldn't be rummaging through the Titanic to bring things up probably also believe that yes, there should be some way to acknowledge the people that died and to acknowledge the disaster and how those things can be avoided in the future. But they just want to do it in a way that honors the memory of the people who suffered and the families who suffered as well, from their family members passing away. But they just want to see it done in a way that is dignified. And I agree with that as well. But the main issue comes to whether or not those items should be picked through. Now, I can't speak for other people, but what I can do is I can kind of give my own personal perspective on it. But before I get to that, I wanted to mention that there is another issue at hand when it comes to the items that have been salvaged. You may or may not have heard that a lot of the items that are salvaged, well, they're done so with permission usually, but nevertheless, those items are usually salvaged by private companies who then own those pieces, auction them off to various museums and collectors who want them, anybody who wants it essentially. It's kind of like a black market, but for Titanic stuff. And so there comes another question as to, well, if we should salvage parts of the Titanic, is it okay to just let those parts go anywhere? And some people think, yes, share the parts of the ship with the world. And other people think, well, no, those parts should go to specific museums that will deal with those artifacts accordingly and correctly. So here's my take on it. Yes, I do believe we should salvage parts of the Titanic, bring it up to the surface for people to be educated on. But let me explain why before everybody gets angry at me. It is part of human nature to pass down our stories. No, it's not necessary to own an artifact of Titanic in order to learn about it and to learn about the individuals who contributed to the safety of others, to the individuals who sacrificed themselves, and even to the individuals who survived. But the thing is that the problem with passing down stories is that eventually those stories become legend. Now, I know in today's modern age, it's hard to believe that that can happen. You think, well, if it's well documented, then it should be fine. Well, the thing is that in the past, humans have documented very well the stories of certain people and certain things that happen. But the problem is that over the course of hundreds of years or even millennia, those stories become less grounded. People start to think, well, wait, that can't happen. Now, I'm not talking about stories of the Bible or stories of Greek mythology in which there are cyclopses running around. What I mean is that there are other stories of people who lived, whom we're not even sure really if the sources that tell us about those people are 100% accurate. They could be interpretations of the person in question. So what I'm trying to get at is, it's possible that a couple hundred years into the future, when people are still talking about Titanic, that the stories of the individuals may once again come into question as to the credibility. You never really know what will happen in the future, as evidenced by our human history. When we look back on our human history, even though certain things are documented, we start to question the authenticity of the documentation. So part of what helps us to validate those things is when we have artifacts of it. We have proof that it happened. Now, I know that it may seem strange for me to bring up this argument when a lot of items have already been recovered from Titanic. You might think, well, these items are up already, don't take any more, we have enough. Well, you just never know. You never know if one day a museum which is housing a massive collection of Titanic artifacts suddenly gets destroyed for some reason, and those artifacts are permanently destroyed. Those artifacts can be gone forever, essentially. So it's best to have more artifacts. It's best to have more things. Plus, there might be individual belongings from certain passengers. Now, I know this is where it gets even more controversial, is should we even be bringing up belongings from the passengers? Let alone pieces of the ship itself, but what about the belongings? I'm of the group that thinks we should bring up some of those belongings. Maybe even most of them. And here's why. Now, I know a lot of people will say, those belongings belong to people who died, and they should stay down there as part of the gravesite. And there are other people who say, don't disturb the dead. They're resting down there. Well, first of all, let me just explain. The people who died are no longer down there. They've been gone for decades. The other point is that I think of it in terms of how would I feel if I had died in the disaster. Now, a lot of the people who died in the Titanic disaster were not really well-known people. Sure, to Titanic historians and to Titanic fanatics, a lot of these names might become household names. But to the general public, we don't know who most of these people were. A lot of them, especially the third-class passengers, were just ordinary folks. They weren't celebrities. They weren't anybody too notable. A lot of them were just people like us who really no one knows their name. And all that's left is possibly their belongings. Maybe it's a shoe, maybe it's a doll or a pocket watch. And I think that some of those people, maybe not all of them, I'm sure a lot of those people might have the same feeling that don't disturb this gravesite. But then there would be people like me. If I was in that disaster, I know that I would want someone to remember me. I don't want to be just a name on some list of passengers. And I think that I would actually want people to salvage my items. Heck, if I died tomorrow, I'd hope that people who appreciated me would come to my apartment and find new homes for my things. So that way they can still be appreciated and I can be remembered. And I think that if I was in the Titanic disaster, I would want to be remembered. I want people to look at objects that I had and go, oh, this was something that he really liked and he really enjoyed having. You know, if I was on Titanic, I think some of the things that would come with me, not just my clothes, but personal belongings that belong to my family. Obviously, the people who were on Titanic weren't there because it was a cruise. It was because they were going from one country to another to start a new life. That was most of the passengers. And so they would have had belongings that belonged to their families. And I think that I would certainly be carrying stuff that belonged to my family. I would want those things to be brought back up to the surface and given to my next of kin or my sibling or anybody in my family. I would want those things to return to them if possible. And if not, I still think it would be nice to have my most treasured things survive and brought up, even if it was in a museum. So that way people can say, this was a person who lived and breathed, who had passions and emotions and things that they loved. And they can see that evidence in whatever is left of me. I think that's a great way to honor somebody. And the best part about that is, even if people forget the stories of my existence, or they over-exaggerate my existence, or they forget my existence, those belongings will help remind people that I was around. I want to show you all something. This is a pair of porcelain doves. This belonged to my great-grandmother. And I no longer own very many things that belonged to her, but this was one of her most prized possessions. And everywhere she moved, from whichever house she lived in, she brought it with her and put it on display. It used to be inside a wooden cabinet made by her husband. That cabinet has since been accidentally destroyed. And most of her belongings I no longer own anymore. I still have some things, and this is one of them. And I remember one of the last times I ever saw her touch this. She was kind of dusting the house, and she picked this up and she cleaned it off, and she said, "It's so pretty. I love this. It's so beautiful." And she set it back down. Now the thing is that on my daily life, I don't think about those little memories very much. But whenever I see these doves, I remember that memory. And I remember how much she loved this thing. And I think that that's the beauty of artifacts of people who no longer are around, is that they help those memories carry on for as long as possible. And so I believe that there probably were people on the Titanic who would have wanted to be remembered in a more material way, not just as a story, not just as a statistic, but as someone who had things that they liked. I think what should be done is, if you're going to bring up personal belongings, I think that you should try to track down who they belong to and see if they are willing to let a qualified museum keep them. If not, they should be able to at least keep some of the belongings. I also think that what should happen with those belongings is that they go to a qualified museum, not to private collectors if possible. I think private collectors should be a last case scenario. It should be a scenario where if a bunch of museums say, "We don't want to take this shoe, we have plenty of artifacts," for some reason, I don't think that would ever happen, but if that did happen and they said, "We can't take this shoe, we have plenty of artifacts," then maybe that item, if it can't be delivered to the family or the next of kin, maybe that item should go to a private collector. I think that's the last case scenario. So that way that item isn't forever lost. It can still be appreciated by somebody who wants to remember what happened. And circling back around to the ship itself, I think that it's perfectly fine to bring up parts of the metal and the wood and the furniture. I think that's perfectly fine. The reason why is because the ship didn't belong to any one person. And frankly, bringing up parts of the ship itself, even if you don't bring up the belongings, bringing up parts of the ship itself and letting those pieces get shared amongst the world will again help the evidence of what happened live on in time. You know, it goes back to what I was saying at the beginning. That you watch the movie, you hear the story, of Titanic, and to you, you know it's real, you know it happened, but it doesn't hit you until you finally see it at a museum. So, in my long-winded way, that is my opinion about salvaging Titanic and its personal belongings and its non-personal belongings. Anyway, I hope that this video got you to kind of question it yourself and to think of it in a different way. Whether or not you were for or against bringing up parts of Titanic, maybe it would have shed some light on a difference of opinion. Anyway, I want to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye. Thank you for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this content, consider supporting my channel by either signing up for my Patreon or to my YouTube memberships. That way you can get exclusive perks in return. Links are in the description below. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.